By 1962, Sister Mary Catherine, for she had been permitted to keep her baptismal name, was middle-aged. She wore bifocals and had minor stomach problems from time to time. She avoided rich desserts. Most evenings she busied herself with reading or correcting papers. Her life was orderly and ordinary, except for one thing. Occasionally now, alone in her room, she rolled herself upward in the air, simply hovering slightly above her bed, in her nightgown in order to enjoy the buoyant air beneath her, instead of the scratchy, overstarched bed linens. She knew by now, having read of the past saints and sisters such as Teresa of Avila and 17th century Maria Vellini, that what she practiced was called levitation. Sister Mary Catherine didn't much care. A word is a word is a word, she told herself with a shrug. In her mind, she still thought of it as rising. But now when she rose, she began to feel part of a larger community. Not the Carmelites of St. Teresa or Sister Maria Vellini's Dominicans. Not her own order either, or the great body of Christians across the earth. Not the unbaptized of Africa, not those poor heathens she was supposed to pray for, and did. Not Democrats or Girl Scouts or the League of Women voters. Those were all perfectly good groups, of course, she told herself primely. But this, which she felt part of, was a collection of people yearning for something they had once had, something they had forgotten. It puzzled her. Then one morning, quite to her surprise, she was called in by Mother Superior and told she was to go to France the following week. She was handed a plane ticket with her name on it and given a passport and instructions. It was not newsworthy, just a brief trip. She would be gone only 5 days to attend a meeting of French scholars. Sister Mary Catherine had written, after all, a definitive paper on Francois de Salignat de la Montfermeil. It had attracted a bit of attention and brought her some prestige to her teaching order, and so dutifully she packed her bag and went. On her first day in Paris, still slightly jet-lagged and preparing her thoughts for the next day's conference, Sister Mary Catherine took a walk. She walked with her head lowered slightly, practicing humility. Mother Superior had suggested she do this, along with biting her tongue if she felt inclined to argue. Quite unexpectedly, for she was not following a map or a guide, she found herself in front of a Gothic cathedral. The massive wooden doors were open, and she noticed a group of tourists wearing sturdy shoes with a guide speaking German to them, just leaving. Quietly, she entered the vast, silent space with its vaulted ceiling. The stone floor was dappled with colored light from the stained glass windows. Surprisingly, there was no one inside. Perhaps she thought it was time for when tourists stopped for lunch or to rest. As for the clergy, well, most of the religious leaders in the world seemed to be in Rome at the moment for an important meeting convened by Pope John XXIII. With permission of her Mother Superior, Sister Mary Catherine had submitted to a formal request, actually asking if she might attend the Second Vatican Council. Such an important meeting would surely affect her and her fellow sisters and their futures, but her letter hadn't even gotten a polite reply. It was met with silence. She dipped her fingers in the basin of the holy water and made the familiar sign of the cross on her habit, and ventured farther down the center aisle. At the same time, From an undistinguished door on the other side of the great cathedral, 2 priests entered. It was their job to close the front doors and adjust the small sign that told the tourists to return after 2 p.m. They started down the lengthy expanse, grumbling to each other about the task. And it was a nuisance. There should be a cleaning person available to handle it. We have better things to do than housekeeping chores like this. They were disgruntled because they had not been sent to Rome. It looked as if stupid Brazil was going to win the World Cup, and they both had a great deal of wine with lunch. They frowned when they saw Sister Mary Catherine. One priest rolled his eyes, recognizing her habit as that from an American order. Mon Dieu, c'est Americain. They hurried forward to tell her she must leave. She didn't argue. She simply ignored them. Her attention had been drawn, quite suddenly, to something in a shadowy corner of a small chapel on her left. The light was very dim in the windowless recess. Brushing past the pair of priests, she moved toward the chapel, waiting until her eyes were adjusted, and then gave a gasp of recognition. It was the 5th chair. Sister Mary Catherine sat down. "Madame, it is not permitted," one priest called in an indignant voice. She rose. "Stop at once," shouted the other furiously. "Vous arrêtez-vous immédiatement." She rose higher. Slowly, silently, she drifted with dignity from the chapel, then swooped into the nave and past the priest, who stood rigid with outrage. She could have tapped their silly little hats off with her foot if it had occurred to her, but her mind and her spirit were elsewhere. She continued to ascend. Finally, at a great height, hovering peacefully aloft in the light from the arch window, she could feel again the familiar sense of being part of a great body of humans in all parts of the world. They were all female. They were remembering. They were beginning to rise and to soar.